guys, today's video is going to be a bit different. We're actually going to be going through the best ways to revise for GCSE English, specifically literature, specifically the poetry section, which is paper 2. I understand it can be quite daunting and there's not really practice questions that you can do per se by yourself. So these are some tips that I found work for if you want to get some of the top grades, grade 9s. So just watch and we'll go through them. Okay, so my first tip would be read the poem, of course, that's the first thing you need to do. You need to read the poem, reread it, read it again, make sure you know what's there. But before analysing it, before getting your highlighters out, your pens out, you need to make sure that you understand the context. That is what's going to get you a grade 9. This is what's going to change your grade from a grade 6, 7, even 8 to a grade 9. Before you start analysing the poem, by that I mean before you look for the metaphors, the similes, all that language analysis, all that structure analysis, you need to make sure you know what the poet is talking about. There are plenty of ways to find out. Obviously, there is YouTube videos. This channel has many YouTube videos specifically about context, and that's why I actually upload the context videos before the language videos for each poem. But if that doesn't work for you, there are so many other ways to find out what the poem is actually about. JSTOR, it's a bit advanced, but it is really great if you are looking for those top grades. Wikipedia is a really good resource. This is really great for finding out social historic context about the poet. And why is this important? Because you need to know what was influencing the poet and therefore why did they write the poem. For example, let's say William Blake. He was around in the late 1700s, a time when the French Revolution had just happened. And so the poem London was directly influenced by what was happening in his time. So Wikipedia gives you some insight about the dates, the history, when the poet was alive, what would have influenced them, and therefore you can make a direct link and you can kind of come up with your own idea of why it was written. And again, this is all context. This is all the things that the examiners are looking for when they're talking about looking for context. So it's so important to understand context that is about the poet and therefore about the poem. This will really help you to understand the poem fully. And obviously there are some more resources for you. The British Library is great, very reliable. BBC websites, again, brilliant. And sometimes the poets have their own biographies. They have their own kind of websites where they're able to put their own opinions and their own thoughts on sometimes even their own poems. So an example of this is Imtiaz Darka, who wrote Tissue. She has her own website and I've been on it, I've seen it, and it's very informative. Detail about why they would have written it, what they were inspired by, all these kind of things. So just check it out. Maybe, some of the poets that are still alive would have websites, and from there you get context again, which we know is very important for the grade 9s. Very important. So you can check them out. Now tip number 2 is it's quite straightforward. If you don't understand words or sentences in the poem, you need to make sure you are looking them up. There is no time for any confusion with these poems because if you weren't aware, you are already going to get an unseen poem in the exam in paper 2, and all of that is not familiar to you. So with these anthology poems that you have been given, you have the chance to understand it fully because you have time. We don't want any gaps in knowledge with these poems. You need to be sure of them, and that's why context from the tip before is so important. But obviously they are hard. They are challenging poems and it's normal to not understand some sentences, some words. And so my advice would be go to genius.com. You might recognize it from like the song lyric thing, but it's really great for poems. It has most of them on there, I've checked. And what you can do is you can scroll over one sentence with your mouse and it comes up in yellow and it gives many people's interpretations of it. One thing to be warned of though is that sometimes the interpretations are very far-fetched. That's okay. GCSEs is all for creativity. You're allowed to be as far-fetched as you want. There is no problem with that. But just make sure that, it still kind of makes sense. I've seen a few very odd things on there. Spark Notes, I'm not going to lie, I think it's a bit basic. I think it's very oversubscribed and I think it's very good for the basics. But if you have already gone through the poem a bit, you've already researched a bit, I think try and get a bit more sophisticated. And the best way to do this, YouTubers. Not just one channel, not just this channel even. Watch loads. Watch many people's and try and figure out what that says loads, by the way. But try and get a range of ideas from different people's perspectives, because that is what's going to get you a boost in your grades. Because you don't just want one interpretation of a poem, you need many. You need many interpretations of one poem, especially in GCSEs, because you need to show the examiner that you're able to contrast your ideas but make it make sense.
Having many interpretations of one poem adds something called depth to your analysis. So instead of having just one opinion on a specific line or on the poem in general. For example, when we look at Ozymandias, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed, remember that line? Instead of having just one opinion on that, for example, the hand that mocked them could have been Ozymandias' hand. If you look at more analyses of this line, right, by doing your research online or by looking at different YouTubers' interpretations or even by putting that line into Google, you can see that actually there's many different interpretations. Some people believe that this is Ozymandias' hand that is mocking his subjects, but other people believe that actually it's the sculptor's hand who is mocking, right, or imitating Ozymandias' face onto stone structures. So hopefully if you have studied Ozymandias, this will kind of be ringing a bell. If you haven't and you're doing the Love and Relationships anthology, Sonnet 29, I think and there is that one sentence, rustle thy boughs and set thy trunk all bare. Now, one interpretation of that could be that it is nature. So rustle the boughs of the trees, set the tree trunk bare. But obviously a deeper interpretation of that is that it is sexual, this idea of rustling, this idea of setting something bare. And even the trunk, which if you look at a human being, their trunk is like their midsection. It's almost like this unclothing aspect to the poem, right? So with one interpretation, you could come up with one thing. But if you delve into it deeper and if you look at other people's opinions on what it could mean, you could have analysis which has a lot more depth to it. So in your essay, you could write something like, in one sense, this sentence could mean blah, blah, blah. But deeper still, this sentence could also represent blah, blah, blah. Now, these two could contrast each other or they could add to each other in order to form a deeper analysis of the poem.
Tip number 3 is one that I'm very passionate about. You're going to start your language analysis after you have kind of solidified the context. You're going to be making notes, you're going to be annotating your poem, but please do not go Pinterest crazy. And by that I mean use colours, but don't be controlled by them. I have seen so many people who are so fixated on getting their notes to be pretty, to be clean, and obviously it's important. You need to be able to read your notes. But the best notes are the messy ones, the ones where your writing starts going horizontal, your page is filled. Stick to colours, but limit them. You don't need to buy the 70 pack of highlighters. You don't need it. It's wasting your time. Be careful with annotations and make sure you are not spending hours making it pretty. And I think personally the best ways to annotate your poems, mind maps and spider diagrams. This is obviously great for when you're annotating the poem straight onto your anthology book. But after that, when you're getting deeper into the language analysis and you want to analyse one sentence at a time, my advice is to get that sentence, write it in the middle of the page, and then start annotating around it. So here's one word. You're going to get your arrow, you're going to write about it. Another phrase, maybe that's a simile, you're going to write about it. Make your mind map bigger, link it. More arrows, you need arrows after arrows. It's going to be amazing and it's going to make your brain just flow with ideas. In the exam, the idea is to just get the thoughts from your head, all those interpretations that you are familiar with, and make them flow. Tip 4 is actually quite important, I think. For the grade 9, it's really, really important to be sophisticated when you're making points, and therefore, I think it is so vital to make sure that you have many, many unique interpretations of one quote rather than very simple, basic ones of many. And, actually this will really help you because you're going to have to learn some quotes of these poems. And I think that's one of the reasons that people find English literature GCSE so hard. You don't need to learn the whole poem. You don't need to learn 20 quotes from each one. Don't learn more than 3 to 4 quotes from each poem, but make sure they are good ones and make sure that you have the opportunity to get so much out of them. Really squeeze them like a sponge. Get all of the water out of each quote that you remember. If it's just 3, make sure you have so much language analysis of that. Make sure it can link to context so well, social historic context. Make sure you can talk about the poet with that quote. Make sure that you can talk about structure. Make sure that you really, really have so many unique interpretations. Right. The English exam is not a recital. They don't want you to word vomit onto the page with the whole poem. I've said this before, it's such a great opportunity to be as unique and as out of the box as you can. Tip number 5, make use of your teachers. When you feel like you have the skills to start a practice question, do it and just practice. Do as many questions as you can. There's a link actually in the description below of a website that you can get some practice questions from. It's the TES one, and I know it's only available for teachers, but there is a sample, and if you look at the bottom, you'll see many questions. Now, your question in the exam will be to compare 2 poems, and that word compare is very vital because that is definitely what they're going to ask you, to compare 2 poems in terms of one theme. Now, I'm using the example of power and conflict. You might be doing the love and relationships cluster, but either way, you are comparing 2. Now, it could be on the theme of, if you're doing the power and conflict, compare these 2 poems in terms of the representation of power, the effects of war, powerful memories, representation of powerful individuals, or power of institutions. They can ask anything like that. In your English lessons, you probably have spent a lot of time going through the themes of the poem. When you get to the exam, you will be given a theme. It will tell you what to talk about, and therefore, you don't need to bring up the other themes, unless it links with the one that they have given you. Really, if the question is asking you about the effects of war, is there really any need to bring up the power of nature? Unless you can really link it in a really unique way with that theme, there is no need. Tip number 6 is all about structure. Examiners are looking for analysis of structure in those grade 9 essays. It really is that kind of thing that will just boost you up that slight bit more. And although it's hard, there are a few things that you can look for in structure, and kind of whenever you start analysing a new poem, think about these 3 things, and it will all link to this of why did the poet structure it this way. So, number 1, are there stanzas? Is the whole poem just a free verse, or is it structured really well? Is it 4 lines per stanza that keeps repeating 4 lines, 4 lines, 4 lines with a very regular break in between? Think about that. What does that say? Is there a rhyme scheme? Think about that, number 2. Is the rhyme scheme regular? Is it like an A, B, A, B? Or is it very irregular? Is there even a rhyme scheme? Why would there be a rhyme scheme? Why would there not be a rhyme scheme? Number 3, what type of poem is it? If you're looking at the power and conflict cluster, and it seems to be a sonnet, a love poem, like we all know Ozymandias is, why would the poet do that? And why would it be in the power and conflict cluster if it's a love poem? Think about it. These 3 questions that you're going to ask yourself are going to lead to that final question: why did the poet choose to structure it this way? Now, tip number 7 actually is not about the poems given in your anthology booklet, but it's about the unseen poetry. It really is just up to you and up to that day in the exam hall about how you do. But there are some ways that you can kind of make it easier for yourself. Now, it's important to note that you are not expected to know any context, any social historic context, because you have not been given time to research that poet. Basically, in the unseen poetry, everything relies on your language analysis. That's the most important thing, language analysis, and structure. There's an example on the next slide, but before we go to that, I'm just going to go through the order of importance in language analysis. You should follow this order because this is what the examiners would be looking for. And number 1, metaphors and similes, juxtapositions and oxymorons. Next, alliteration, repetition. So there's a lot to talk about with that. And lastly, semantic and lexical fields is always a great start if you're confused, but it really doesn't hold as much power as these three, I think. So here is the example that you can find on the AQA website. It's the June 2018 paper, and it is the unseen poetry. This one is the 24 marks one. If you weren't aware, you're also going to get an 8 marks question after this, but obviously because it's more marks, we focus on this one for much longer. What we're going to do when we get our unseen poem in the exam is we're going to look at the word that the examiner is asking you. The question is asking you, how? So this word, how, is really asking you to look at what language techniques is used and what structure. And they're asking about the speaker's attitude to growing old. Don't go looking for themes in this poem. There's no need. You only need to look for this.
With the unseen poem, I think it's so important to practice because you know that it relies on your language analysis skills. So because of that, get any poem off Google Images. If you're doing the power and conflict cluster, use the love and relationships and vice versa, and just analyze the language. You need to do this probably once a week and make your teachers mark it. This is a really important point and it's really underrated. You know, it's 24 marks. That is a lot. That is a lot of marks. And as well as this, once you start analysing language in poems you don't know, it becomes so much easier to analyse language in the poems from your anthology book. So really, it's making your life easier in 2 ways.
Now the final tip, it isn't really a tip, but at the time that I put this video out, we are in a pandemic.
Coronavirus! Coronavirus!
We are all in lockdown, we're at home, and I assume you guys are in year 10 right now, as year 11 don't have their exams. So the question is, should I start revising now? I know a lot of other YouTubers are saying, start now, you retain the information will be straight in your head. But personally, when I did GCSEs, I didn't start revising till 2 months before my exam, let alone a year before. So my advice really would be to, even if you haven't learnt your poems, read them. No one's asking you to analyse them yet. No one's asking you to do that hard work of remembering them. Just read them. My next tip would be to look at context. Use all the resources, use the YouTube videos, use my YouTube videos. I'm putting them out every week on each poem, and I will be doing the love and relationships one very soon. Look at context. And honestly, this is where I'd stop at this point. If you're eager at this point of the year, you could start analysing language. These two, important. This one, wait for your teacher. Unless, of course, you've already been through the poems with your teachers, then go for it. My suggestion is January. I would start revising that January. Best time, the information will be there. So overall, these are my tips. If you like them, subscribe so we can keep making more videos, and yeah, see ya.